Welcome to this interview practice session, which is focused on the quantity surveying profession, and today we're going to look at 100 common interview questions you may be asked within a job interview for a QS position. And during the interview, we're going to look at each question in detail and explain some of the answers you can give. And if it's the case that you're a graduate quantity surveyor looking to start your career, or an intermediate QS who is looking to secure your next career move, I really hope you find this video useful. And whilst I can't claim to be an expert in this area, I have practiced as a QS for the last 15 years and have attended job interviews in this capacity as both a prospective employee and hirer, and I really hope you find this video useful. So before we go into the main questions and answers, we should note that the first 30 questions are entry-level questions aimed to assist graduate quantity surveyors with starting their career, and the next 70 questions are more advanced questions aiming to assist intermediate quantity surveyors with some experience in securing their next career move, and these questions are pitched at an intermediate to senior level. The questions and answers discussed are applicable to both professional quantity surveyors who work with clients and consultancy organisations, and they are also applicable to contractors quantity surveyors working directly for a main contractor or subcontracting organisation. So without further ado, let's go straight into the Q&A practice. And as mentioned, the first 30 questions are aimed at a graduate to entry level. The first question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the key roles and responsibilities of quantity surveyors within the construction industry? And to address this, candidates could advise the roles and responsibilities could be broken down into both pre-contract duties and post-contract duties, and some of the pre-contract duties would include producing cost estimates and cost planning documents, compiling and issuing tender documents, compiling and issuing contract documentation, attendance at design team meetings, and providing value engineering advice. And post-contract duties may include issue of monthly cost reports or cost value reconciliation reports, pricing and monitoring of post-contract variations, submission and review of interim valuations, and negotiation and agreement of final accounts. Next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain the difference between a defined and non-defined provisional sum? And to address this, the candidate can advise firstly that a defined provisional sum is where the scope of works is known and clearly described. The contractor can reasonably estimate the cost because enough information, for example drawings and specifications, is available. The contractor is therefore deemed to have included for all preliminary costs associated with expending the defined provisional sum. A non-defined provisional sum is where the scope of works is unclear and not fully described at the time of entering into the contract. The contractor is therefore deemed not to have included for preliminary costs associated with expending the provisional sum and may seek additional costs for this. Can you please explain your understanding of the term retention? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that retention is a sum of money held back when making an interim payment. This can be retained by the client or main contractor, usually at around 3% or 5%, depending on the contractual terms that have been agreed. Retention is held until defects within the works have been made good and serves as an incentive to return to site and rectify all defects within the works. 50% of retention is often released at practical completion of the works, and the remaining 50% is released when all defects have been made good. A follow-up question we may receive on this area is, what is the significance of practical completion being granted? And to address this, candidates can advise that this is where 50% of retention is released, the works are handed over by the main contractor to the client, and the defects liability period commences. Insurances of the building will need to be maintained by the client, and liquidated damages for subsequent period of delays following practical completion can no longer be applied against the main contractor. The next question we'll take a look at is, what would happen if practical completion was not achieved on time? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that a non-completion certificate would need to be issued. If a non-completion certificate is not issued, then time is at large. This means no LADs can be applied to the main contractor for the period of delay. It is therefore advisable to issue a non-completion certificate as soon as possible, otherwise time is at large and the contractor has no active revised completion date and has to complete the works within a reasonable time frame. The next question we'll take a look at is, how would you respond if the client tells you that the LADs are to be £100,000 per week? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that they would check the LAD figure is based on a genuine pre-estimate of financial loss and explain that in the event LADs are to be applied, they would need to substantiate this figure. I would also explain that if the figure inserted into the contract is shown to be punitive and not based on genuine financial loss, it is therefore not likely to be enforceable. In this scenario, the employer will have to pursue the main contractor for any contractual loss that can be substantiated through a formal dispute resolution procedure. The next question we'll take a look at is, what are liquidated damages? And to explain this, the candidate can advise that these are a genuine pre-estimate of the likely loss incurred by the employer should the completion date not be met. Moving into cost planning and cost estimating now, the next question we'll take a look at is, what is the difference between a cost estimate and a cost plan? And to address this, candidates could advise firstly that a cost estimate is compiled based on early stage design information and is often reliant on historic cost information. The level of accuracy of a cost estimate is often lower than a cost plan, as it is essentially a pre-contract prediction on the outturn costs of the works. For example, a cost per square metre estimate is based on the high level area of the building multiplied by a cost per square metre rate. A cost plan is often more detailed and breaks the costs of each component of the building into elemental parts. And cost plans are developed further as and when more design information is available, and will break the cost down into components such as substructure, superstructure, and professional fees. And the next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain which forms of contract you're aware of? And to address this, candidates first of all can advise of JCT minor works, JCT intermediate form, JCT design and build, NEC option A with activity schedule, NEC target cost, FIDIC, and ICE. This is just a guide on some of the contract forms you can make reference to. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain how you keep up to date with current affairs and matters that affect the quantity surveying profession? And to address this, candidates could advise that they read Building Magazine, the Estates Gazette, that they review BCIS tender price indices updates, they review RICS guidance notes, that they keep up to date with feedback from clients and their supply chain, and finally that they review the BBC News website. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your approach if you realised you had overvalued the works? And to address this, candidates could advise firstly that they would recheck the valuation, they would review with the contractor and client and work out a sensible adjustment, and if the timings allow, a pay less notice can be issued to correct the valuation, and a revised valuation can be negotiated with the main contractor and client. If the works are overvalued and it's not possible to undertake the above adjustments, these would then be made in the following valuation. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain the main methods for selecting a contractor? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that there is open tendering, selective tendering, both single or two-stage, there is negotiated tendering, and serial tendering. A follow-on question we may receive on this area is, can you please explain your understanding of open tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise that open tendering is an indiscriminate request for tenders to be submitted to the open market. This could be achieved by advert placement in local papers or technical press, which invites contractors to apply for the tender documentation. There are little or no barriers to entry needed to submit a tender. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of negotiated tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise that this is where the client has an existing preference for appointing a particular firm and only negotiates with one contractor. And this is usually used when the client has previously used a contractor and has a specific preference to use them again. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain how you would conduct yourself with a new client? And to address this, candidates could advise firstly that they will be sure to be friendly, engaging, and enthusiastic. They would be inquisitive about key challenges they may be facing. They would ensure at all times that they are well presented, polite, conscientious, and respectful. The next question we'll take a look at is, why is client care so important? And to address this, the candidate could advise firstly that surveying practices that provide excellent client care are likely to retain existing clients and develop new business leads by receiving positive testimonials. A failure to provide good client care is likely to lead to client dissatisfaction, complaints, and in worst case scenario, professional indemnity insurance claims for professional negligence. Formal complaints and insurance claims can be costly and result in a stressful working environment, reduced staff performance, and they can also be time consuming. Complaints and claims can and should be avoided with diligence, manageable workloads, and resource planning, as well as well-developed procedures for obtaining and acting on customer feedback. And the next question we'll discuss is, how do you establish trust with a new client? And to address this, candidates got advised they are transparent and honest about their actions at all times. They learn about the client and their long-term objectives, in addition to key challenges that they are facing. The candidate could advise that they only act in the parameters of their level of experience and competence, that they always act in a professional manner, and always provide a high level of service. A few questions aimed at helping quantity surveyors operating at an intermediate to senior level. And the first question we'll take a look at under this section is, how would you advise a client who wanted to know what sources of cost information are available in order to compile a feasibility estimate? And to address this, candidates could advise firstly that they have access to internal benchmarking data from previous projects that could be utilised. There is also the opportunity to utilise previous tender submissions, industry sources of cost information such as the Building Cost Information Service, SPONS, Laxton's, and also references made to sources of cost information in the assumptions and exclusions. The next question we'll take a look at is, what kind of cost advice did you provide to your client as the design progressed from RIBA work stage 1 to stage 4? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that at RIBA stage 1, preparation and brief, the level of design detail available is usually restricted to the schedule of accommodation and high-level design aspirations. At this stage, I would be able to prepare a cost per square metre estimate using internal benchmarking data and industry source cost information. Using applicable rates and the GIFA, I was able to provide the client with a high-level estimate. As the design progresses into RIBA work stage 2 to 4, this is the concept design through to technical design, project drawings and specifications become available, and we are then able to use these to compile an elemental cost plan by taking off quantities from the project drawings. This can be provided to the client with a much more accurate estimate, breaking down the building into cost headings from the substructure, superstructure, services and professional fees. The next question we'll take a look at is, what level of contingency did you recommend to the client, or would you recommend to the client? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that with input from the project design team, we would be usually able to jointly produce a risk register identifying each of the project risks. Each risk would be assigned a probability and impact profile, and the QS's duty is usually to advise the team on cost allocations against each risk item should these be realised. By pricing the risk register and assigning probability and impact profiles, the contingency can then be calculated and updated as the scheme progresses. The next question we'll take a look at is, how would you advise a client to proceed if the cost plan exceeds the budget? And to address this, candidates can advise that they would analyse the costs to assess the sources of the increase and whether any element of work is abnormally high against the initial order of cost estimate. QSs can then, as a QS, we can then typically propose value engineering to the client and the design team. Can you please explain your understanding of the term functional unit? And to address this, candidates can advise, first of all, that a functional unit means a unit of measurement used to represent the prime use of a building or part of a building, typically used when preparing a cost estimate. For example, when preparing a cost estimate for a hotel, the functional unit would be the cost per bedroom. If preparing a cost estimate for a hospital, this would typically be presented as a cost per bed. And if this is in reference to a cost estimate for retail space, then the functional unit would be the metre squared of net retail space. And this can also include associated circulation space. The next question we'll take a look at is what items have you typically excluded when producing a feasibility cost estimate? And when addressing this will be specific to the candidate's own experience. However, as a guide, the candidate could make reference to the exclusions of professional fees, VAT, client decant costs, loose fixture and fittings, inflation, site acquisition costs, Section 106 agreements, and removal of any asbestos. The next question we'll take a look at is why is VAT typically excluded from a cost estimate? And to address this, candidates can advise that because different clients will incur different levels of VAT, we are not best placed to advise on any VAT cost implications. And in some cases, for example for charity organisations, VAT may not even be applicable. As QSs, we would not be in a position to know the correct rate of VAT unless informed of it, and that is why VAT is typically excluded when preparing a cost estimate. The next question we'll take a look at is going into construction technology experience, and under this section, the first question we'll take a look at is can you please explain the different types of pile foundations? And to address this, candidates can make reference to sheet piles, secant piles, board piles, and precast piles. The next question we'll take a look at under this section is how does CFA board piles work? And CFA is referenced to continuous flight auger piles. And to address this, candidates can first of all advise that CFA piles are constructed by rotating a hollow stem continuous flight auger into the soil. This bores out subsoils to a design depth, and concrete or grout is then pumped through the hollow stem, maintaining static head pressure. This then fills the cylindrical cavity created as the auger is then slowly removed. Is what advice would you give to a client who is wanting to know the technical disadvantages of a steel frame construction? And to address this, the candidates can advise that the disadvantages of steel frames include that steel frames require fire protection, certain parts of the steel frame may need replacing over time, the price of steel is highly variable and can fluctuate, resulting in increased cost uncertainty. There's typically a need for experienced builders and specialist steel frame installers that typically carries a higher installation cost than alternative methods. And because of this specialism, this resource may be harder to acquire than other forms. The next question we'll take a look at is what different forms of fire protection are you aware of that can be used on steel frames? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that they are aware of intumescent paint, fire protective boarding, SFRM or spray applied fire resistant material. And the next question we'll take a look at is can you please tell me what elements you would typically include within an interim valuation? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that the interim valuation would typically include preliminary items, the measured works items, any variation items, materials on site, materials off site, and any loss and expense claims. The next question we'll take a look at is how would you advise your clients on using standard versus bespoke forms of contract? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that this would be dependent on the client's objectives, and we would typically as a QS make them aware of the implications of both options and advise them accordingly. For example, standard forms are written by legal experts, the rights and obligations of each party are clearly set out to the required level of detail. Any risks should have been allocated appropriately between the parties under a standard form, and parties should be familiar with the provisions in the form which provides greater consistency in application and fewer unforeseen anomalies. The time and expense of preparing a fresh document for each project is also avoided. There is also the fact that case law is built up over time on standard forms, which provides a good source of knowledge and clarity of the terms. Can you please explain which items must be in place before liquidated damages can be deducted? And to address this, candidates can advise that a non-completion certificate and a pay less notice must both be in place under a JCT contract in order for LADs to be deducted. The next question we'll take a look at is how would you value materials off-site within an interim valuation? And to address this, candidates can advise that when valuing materials off-site during the project, we would need to obtain proof of ownership that the materials would transfer to the employer upon payment. for example, a vesting certificate. Insurances must also be in place until the materials arrive at site. Materials must clearly be labelled as being intended for the site and set apart from other materials, and a materials offsite bond must be in place if required under the terms of the contract. The next question we'll take a look at is what items would you normally include within a cost report or a financial statement? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that they would typically report on the contract sum, any instructed variations, potential future variations as advance warnings, any claims, the anticipated final account total, and the total of the certified payments. The next question we'll take a look at is what is the purpose of a financial report? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that this is to report against budgeted values and act as a working cost check on the project budget. It's also there to give the client an understanding of any savings or additional money required, and it's there to report on contract progress against pre-contract predictions. The next question we'll take a look at is how would you advise a client on reviewing an adverse weather claim? And to address this, candidates can advise that on receipt of the claim, this would need to be supported by historical weather data, taking into account the time of year and region the project in question is located in. The contractor's claim should be based on data from a recognised independent source, such as the Met Office, and the rainfall and temperatures referenced would be compared against previous years to determine if these would adversely impact the progress of the main contractor. The prolongation period should also be equivalent to the extension of time being sought. Can you please explain your understanding of the difference between defined or undefined provisional sums? And to address this, the candidate can advise that defined provisional sums are those that are sufficiently well defined and or detailed to allow the contractor to make allowances for them in their programming, planning and pricing preliminaries. In order for a provisional sum to be defined, there will be sufficient design information to describe how the works in question is to be fixed to the building, in which location and in what quantity. This is not in place for undefined provisional sums, and therefore the contractor cannot be deemed to have included for prelims when expending a undefined provisional sum. The next question we'll take a look at is how would you measure the site cut and fill? And to address this, candidates can advise that they would obtain the project drawings, they would use the existing levels and proposed levels. This would then divide the area of excavation into a grid and populate the levels on the grid to establish an average existing and proposed level, and this is to determine which areas require excavation and which areas require imported material. The next question we'll take a look at is what is a prime cost sum? And to address this, candidates can advise that a prime cost sum is a cost of an item that has either not been selected or where the price was unknown at the time the contract was entered into. A prime contract sum is a cost of an item that has either not been selected or where the price was unknown at the time the contract was entered into. If the price of the item chosen is different than the prime cost sum, the client will pay the builder the difference plus a profit margin as stated in the contract. Typically, this is used on items such as the cost of bricks or roof tiles, where the prime cost sum is based on a cost per thousand. How would you advise your client on dealing with an error that was contained within the bill of quantities? And to address this, the candidate could advise that on identification of the error, they would advise a client that if identified prior to the contract being signed, then this could be discussed with the contractor and amended in accordance with the option notified within the instructions for tenderers. However, once a contract has been signed, both parties must stand by the rate within the contract, even if it was incorrect. Only through an agreement will the parties be able to amend the rate. And the next question we'll take a look at is what is meant by the acronyms GEA and GIA. And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that GEA stands for gross external area, and this is the area of the building measured externally at each floor level, whereas GIA stands for gross internal area, and this is the area of the building measured to the internal face of the perimeter walls at each floor level. A follow-on question we may receive is where are these acronyms defined? And to address this, the candidate can advise that this is contained within the Code of Measuring Practice published by the RICS. The next question we'll take a look at is how would you advise your clients when selecting on a procurement route? And to address this, the candidate could advise that when advising clients previously, they've always been sure to give due consideration to their objectives in relation to cost, time, design control, quality assurance, and risk transfer. For example, under a design and build procurement route, this offers good risk transfer, but there are trade-offs against paying risk premiums and a loss of design control when compared to a traditional procurement route. And the next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the traditional procurement route? And to address this, candidates can first of all advise that under a traditional procurement route, the design is completed by the client's design team before competitive tenders are invited and a main contractor is then appointed to build what the designers have specified. The contractor takes responsibility and financial risk for the construction of the works to the design produced by the client's design team, and this is for the contract sum within the contracted period. The client takes the responsibility and risk for the design and design team performance. The next question we'll take a look at is, how does the traditional procurement route work? And to address this, candidates can advise that the contractor takes responsibility and financial risk for the construction of the works to the design produced by the client's design team for the contract sum within the contracted period. And the client takes responsibility and risk for the design and design team performance. And over on the flow diagram, we can see that the client has direct relationships with both separate relationships with the architect and direct links to the main contractor, who have separate responsibility for both the design on the architect side and the construction on the main contractor's side. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain the advantages of traditional procurement? And to address this, candidates can advise, first of all, that a key advantage is that the client retains control over the design, which can lead to higher quality. There are also increased levels of cost certainty prior to commencement, and design changes are reasonably easy to arrange and value. Please explain the disadvantages of traditional procurement. And to address this, candidates can advise that the overall project duration may be longer than others due to lack of overlap between design and construction, and there is no input into design and planning by the contractor. A strategy based on price competition can also lead to adversarial relations during the post-contract construction period, and there is also a dual point of responsibility with the design team controlling the design and the contractor retaining responsibility for the construction, which can lead to separate team dynamics. The next question we'll take a look at is, what is design and build procurement? And to address this, candidates can advise that design and build is where the contractor is responsible for both the design, planning, organisation, control, and construction of the works to the employer's requirements. The employer gives the tenderers the employer's requirements, and the contractor responds with the contractor's proposals, which include the price for the works. Over on the flow diagram, we can see that the client has a single relationship with the main contractor, and it's the main contractor who has direct links with the architect, meaning that they are both responsible for the design and the construction of the works under design and build procurement. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain the advantages of design and build? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that there is a single point of responsibility for the design and construction. There is earlier commencement on site. There is earlier price certainty, which is increased due to the main contractor being committed to a fixed price lump sum. And the client can also benefit from the contractor's experience harnessed during the design phase. The next question we'll take a look at is, what are the disadvantages of design and build? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that clients may find it hard to prepare a sufficiently comprehensive brief. The client has to commit to a concept design early on in the process. Variations from the original brief are difficult to arrange and are often expensive. It is also harder to compare tenders and harder to determine whether value for money is being achieved. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of management contracting procurement? And to address this, candidates can advise that the management contractor has direct contractual links with all of the works contractors, and they have responsibility for the construction of the works without actually carrying them out. Not all of the design needs to be completed for the works to commence, and the main contractor selects the works contractors through competitive open book tender. The client reimburses the cost of these packages to the main contractor plus their management fee. And we can see over on the flow diagram that the client has a direct relationship with the management contractor, who then subsequently organises the separate individual works packages. The next question we'll take a look at is, what are the advantages of management contracting? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that the overall project duration is shorter due to overlapping design and construction. There is contractor contribution to the design and planning process. Changes can be accommodated in packages not yet let, providing that they have no impact on the packages that are previously let. And the works are let competitively at current market prices on a firm price basis. The next question we'll take a look at is, what are the disadvantages of management contracting? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that the price for the works is not received until the last package has been let, which reduces cost certainty for the client. Changes to the design of later packages may affect packages already previously let, and there is little incentive for the management contractor to reduce costs. In practice, the main contractor has little legal responsibility for the defaults of the works contractors. Can you please explain your understanding of construction management? And to address this, candidates first of all can advise that in construction management, the employer places a direct contract with each of the trade contractors and utilises the expertise of a construction manager who acts as a consultant to coordinate the contracts. The trade contractors carry out the construction works, and the construction managers supervises the construction process and coordinates the design team. The construction manager has no contractual links with the trade contractors or members of the design team. Their role includes preparation of the programme, determining requirements for site facilities, breaking down the project into suitable works packages, obtaining and evaluating tenders, and coordinating and supervising the works. The next question we'll take a look at is, what are the advantages of construction management procurement? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that the overall project duration is reduced by overlapping design and construction. The construction manager can contribute to the design and project planning processes. Roles, risks and relationships for all parties are clear, and changes in design can be accommodated without paying a premium. Prices may also be lower due to direct contracts with trade contractors, and the client has a means of redress to trade contractors through direct contractual links. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the disadvantages of construction management? And to address this, candidates can advise that price certainty is not achieved until the last trade package is let. Changes to packages may adversely affect packages that have already been previously let. The client must be proactive and hands-on, as they have many contractual links to each of the trade packages, and the client has a lot of consultants and contractors to deal with. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of single-stage tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that single-stage tendering is a structured process of receiving competitive tenders from a number of pre-selected capable contractors. Contractors are pre-selected based on their financial standing, qualifications and certifications, the previous track record and references, an organisational structure, and capacity and resources. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain the advantages of single-stage tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, it ensures only capable and approved firms submit tenders, and it tends to reduce the aggregate cost of tendering. And it reduces the risk of receiving tenders from unsuitable contractors. The next question we'll take a look at is, what is two-stage tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise that two-stage tendering is where the client seeks to appoint the contractor based on an outline scope of work that is not yet fully defined. The Client then works with the appointed contractor to develop the scope of work and reach an agreed price. This can be used when it is useful to obtain the contractor's buildability experience on the planning of the project and gain an earlier contractor involvement. Please explain your understanding of the purpose of the first stage of two-stage tendering. And to address this, candidates can advise that the first stage is where the client provides an outline project design to each of the tenderers. And the tendering contractors will submit prices for helping the client develop and finalise their design using their buildability experience. Tender submissions will typically consist of a schedule of rates that will be used to calculate the agreed price during stage 2, and a price for assisting the client with design development and buildability expertise during stage 2. Confirmation of the contractor's overheads and profit percentages will also typically be provided at this stage. A preferred contractor is then appointed to assist with developing the design further during the second stage. The next question we'll take a look at is what is the purpose of the second stage of two-stage tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise that following development of the design to a defined stage, a formal negotiation process is undertaken during stage 2, and this is to agree the final price, the contract conditions, and the programme. What is negotiated tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise that this is where the client has an existing preference for appointing a particular firm and only negotiates with one contractor. The next question we'll take a look at is how does negotiated tendering work? And to address this, candidates can advise that this is when the contractor has carried out work successfully for the client previously and where they have an existing relationship. There is no competition and only one contractor is invited to tender. The contract sum is arrived at by a process of negotiation, and a schedule of rates or prices from previous projects may be used as a basis of agreeing a price. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of serial tendering? And to address this, candidates can advise that serial tendering is where contractors are asked to bid for a project on the basis that if they complete their initial project satisfactorily, other projects of a similar type will follow and the same bill rates will be applied. The next question we'll take a look at is what issues could selecting the main contractor lead to? And to address this, candidates can advise that this could create a bad client and contractor relationship. It could also lead to a dissatisfied client, and it could also lead and result in the insolvency of the main contractor. Next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the form of tender? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that the form of tender is a pre-printed formal statement in which the tenderer fills in the blank spaces. And the tenderer provides their name, address, and the sum of money for which they offer to carry out the works. And the next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the term the employer's requirements? And to address this, candidates can advise that the employer's requirements set out the client's requirements, including the function, size, accommodation, and quality requirements of the project. Their level of detail depends on how much design development has been carried out prior to tender, and they normally include the current state of planning permission and also detail the level of design, structure, and specification information to be provided by the tenderers. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the contractor's proposals? And to address this, candidates can advise that the CPs or contractor's proposals are the contractor's response to the employer's requirements. They are the key documentation for the client to consider at tender review, and they often include plans, elevations, sections, and typical details. Layout drawings and specification for materials and workmanship are also provided. The next question we'll take a look at is, after a valuation has been undertaken and a payment certificate has been issued, we have a scenario where the client has advised that they don't have sufficient funding to make the payment, and how would you respond as a QS in this scenario? To address this, candidates can advise firstly that once the certificate has been issued to the contractor, the client is contractually obliged to honour the payment of the payment certificate and cannot withhold money without a valid reason. If this were the case, I would contact the client and contractor as soon as possible to arrange some form of payment. It may be the case that the client has insufficient funds available in time for the final payment date. However, it may be possible to defer the payment by 1 to 2 days. However, failing this, or if the contractor is unwilling to delay, the client would need to find finance to make the payment. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain which items you would include within a valuation? And to address this, candidates can advise that typically valuation would include prelims, measured works, materials on-site and off-site, any variations, claims, retention, and previous payments made. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the defects liability period? And to address this, candidates can advise that the defects liability period is a duration at the end of the contract, usually 52 weeks after the substantial completion certificate has been issued, whereby the contractor undertakes to rectify any defects that arise within the structure at the contractor's expense. And this is providing that the defects were due to materials and workmanship not being in accordance with the contract. In the event that the contractor failed to rectify any defects, the employer may employ another contractor to carry out the works and recover the cost of doing this from the main contractor. The retention money being retained may be used to cover the cost of making good. And the next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain when you would use a JCT minor works contract? And to address this, candidates can advise, firstly, that a JCT minor works would be used typically projects that are short in duration on a small scale with a straightforward construction. JCT guidance advises that a minor works form is used typically for contract values up to £200,000 where the works are simple in nature. The contract must be in lump sum form where design should be completed prior to execution, and the employer or their team is to provide specifications, drawings and schedules of works. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of when you would use a JCT intermediate contract? And to address this, candidates can advise that the intermediate form is recommended for projects that do not exceed a 1-year duration. The projects should be simple in content and require only basic skills and trades, where services are not complex and where the works are already designed. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain when you would typically use a JCT design and build contract? And to address this, candidates can advise that a JCT design and build would typically be used when the contractor is responsible for design and construction. The project should be similar in complexity to that of a standard building contract, and the contractor's proposals form the basis of the contract. There is no mention of an architect or QS, and instead, this role is replaced by the title of the employer's agent. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the term cost value reconciliation? And to address this, candidates can advise that a cost value reconciliation is used to measure the project's ongoing costs and income against budgeted values at the start of the project. This allows the profitability of the project to be determined at a given point in time throughout the project lifecycle. The next question we'll take a look at is, how would you prepare a cost value reconciliation? And to address this, candidates can advise firstly that they would determine the cumulative costs and value of the project to a set given point in time. The cut-off date may coincide with an agreed accounting period or month-end period, and this would typically be established with the project team. I would then carry out cost checks to ensure, firstly, that no high value fluctuations in costs or value are expected during the reporting period, that all work in progress is accounted for and the reported values are in line with subcontractors' measures and liabilities. Any risk and contingency items must have been included for any items not yet agreed. And when all costs and value items are finalised, I would then determine the current profitability of the project and compare this against the original budgeted values. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the term cash flow analysis? And to address this, candidates can advise that a cash flow analysis is used to calculate the project incomes, and we could look to utilise the agreed payment schedule set out under the terms of the contract, the programme and the bill of quantities or activity schedule. This could then be used to accurately profile when the income is anticipated to be received, and plot these dates on the cash flow forecast. If this information is not available, it may be possible to use information such as a cash flow analysis software to plot a typical S-curve. And for the outgoings, I would liaise with the supply chain to gain an insight of when invoices and payments are expected to become due, and take an extra care to account for any long lead items. And the next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the term accruals? And to address this, candidates can advise that accruals are made within the financial accounting systems that are operated to take into account any anticipated invoices that are not yet paid to date. The accrual can be calculated as a difference in the total liability that is due to a subcontractor or supplier against the amount already paid to date. And the accruals are retained as anticipated cash outflows not yet incurred, and in theory, the older the accruals are, the less likely they are to be paid and may be released at a given point in time. The next question we'll take a look at is, can you please explain your understanding of the term contracharge? And to address this, candidates can advise that contracharges are issued as a deduction to a subcontractor's works package as a result of a cost item that has been incurred due to their activity on site. For example, a contracharge could be issued due to damage of property or equipment due to a subcontractor's failure to put in place adequate protection of their working area. That brings us towards the end of the Q&A practice. I really hope you found this video useful, and please be sure to subscribe to this channel to receive ongoing Q&A support.